All right, welcome everyone. I am Jim O'Connell. I'm the senior berry and grape educator at Ulster County Cooperative Extension. This is a Lunch and Learn webinar with Mike Hughes from Injury and Health Management Solutions Incorporated, a company based out of Vermont. The topic today is agricultural ergonomics injury prevention training. This is part of a grant. The material is based on work done by, supported by the USDA NIFA through the Northeast Risk Management Education. Brief background on Mike. So Mike graduated from Colby Sawyer College with a bachelor's degree in health promotion and from Bay State College with an associate's degree as a physical therapist assistant. He's also a certified ergonomic evaluation specialist. And so he works closely with companies. So some major companies here are Green Mountain Power, Vermont Electric Power Company, and some others as well, providing ergonomic evaluations, on-site therapy, and injury prevention programs. His focus is in outpatient orthopedic physical therapy, as well as promotion of workplace wellness and injury prevention. And he has been a member of IHMS since 2015. Welcome, Mike. Thank you for hosting this. I'm going to stop my share and turn it over to you and turn off my video.
Absolutely. I appreciate it. Thank you very much. I'm going to start my share here. And I will just have anyone confirm for me just that you are able to view this and hear me. Is that true? Is everyone able to see that and hear me okay?
Yes. Looks good, Mike.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. I appreciate it. Thank you. So yeah, just like James was saying, we're a company based out of Vermont. We tour around and we work with all kinds of different production companies. And our goal is really to prevent injuries and kind of stop them from happening. Also growing up in rural Vermont, I do kind of have the privilege of, experiencing quite a bit of agriculture work, primarily, mostly, dairy farms down this way, which, unfortunately seems to be less and less as time goes on. But, I can know personally how hard that work can be. And, whether you're dairy farming, whether you're doing more of an agricultural planting, harvesting, there's a lot of hard work that goes into it. So it certainly places us at higher risks for injuries and issues. And one thing that I really like doing about these presentations is just that, if we can stop injuries before they happen, that's the easiest way to deal with them, because we see injuries on a large scale. We see them from start to finish. We have our own private physical therapy clinic as well in Vermont. So we treat injuries. And I always tell people the best way to deal with an injury and get treatment is to actually stop it from happening in the first place. So that's what we'll plan on doing today, going through just giving some education, some tips and things to think about, specifically with, agricultural tasks and hobbies and things that we may be doing. So one other thing that I like to say, I know that it's tough doing presentations with Zoom, a little bit different. If people do have questions or anything like that, feel free to kind of speak up. It doesn't throw me off if someone wants to interrupt and ask a question kind of as I'm in the middle of presenting. That's not going to offend me. So if you have something and you don't want to forget it, I will add some time at the end to have some question answering time opportunities. But, if you feel like you're going to forget, you really have something you'd like to ask, feel free to speak up and ask. Okay. So we will kind of get into it. We're talking about ergonomics and injury prevention. So what we're really going to be discussing for the majority today is, musculoskeletal disorders, or more specifically, cumulative trauma disorders. These are basically just injuries to muscles, tendons, ligaments, nerves, other structures within the body. One thing that's important to realize here that I'd like to point out is more times than not, they're going to come from multiple risk factors. So what we'll do as we work through this presentation is we'll actually look at some risk factors and things that are going to increase, probability for injuries. If you're seeing some of these and you're checking the box, don't be too alarmed, because more times than not, it's going to be a combination of multiple factors that lead to actual injury. One other thing that I really like to do at the start of these presentations, which this is a little goofy, so bear with me on these, but I like to get people to think about their body as a machine, because that's really what we are. We have a lot of different systems and a lot of different moving parts that have to work together and kind of fire in sync in order to keep us going and functioning. So we really are a machine. So one thing, just to get people thinking about that, I like to take kind of simple machines A tractor, for example, is an easy one that some people may or may not have had some exposure to, but same thing. You're going to have breakdown and you're going to have repair that needs to happen on a machine such as a tractor. So, some common things that we may see with tractors that we have to deal with, tire pressures, right? Replacing tires, split tires, oil levels, topping off oils, fluids, right? Hydraulic fluids, radiators, cleaning out radiator screens. There's a lot of different normal maintenance that we just expect. It's wear and tear, and it happens. Greasing joints, all kinds of things that you can think about on a tractor that we do kind of somewhat regularly, or we should be doing somewhat regularly to help maintain that machine. Your body's the same exact way. Every day, especially in a field such as agriculture, you're going to be breaking down your body. You're going to be putting strain and stress to it day in and day out. So what I like to get people thinking about is, what are we doing as maintenance in order to maintain our machine, so to say. So keep that in the back of your mind as we work through this presentation. I know it's a little bit of a cheesy analogy, but I think it carries a lot of weight. So just keep that in your mind as we work through things. Muscle memory is another really big thing that I like to get people to think about right from the start of a presentation. And when we're thinking about, our body and stopping injuries. So basically what happens within the body, and it's really an efficiency thing, is that, we develop work patterns and muscle memory. And the reason being is, we just don't have to work quite as hard in order to complete a task. So, a really easy example, anyone that's ever driven a standard transmission, which again, I know that's kind of fading out as time goes on. But anyone that's ever driven a standard transmission, the first time you pull out of a stop sign and you're going through the gears, you're kind of looking down and you're grinding gears, and it's pretty rough, right? Everyone in the passenger seats may be ragging on you a little bit because it's such a rough transition. You have to think, and you really have to force that whole movement as you go through a gearbox. As time goes on and you drive more and more, right, you get to the point where you can pull out of a stop sign with your Dunkin' Donuts in one hand and a bagel in the other and kind of rip through the gears, no issue, smooth as can be. And what happens is your body it gets used to the movements that you do, and it creates those patterns so that you don't have to work quite as hard and you don't have to use as much brain energy to complete simple tasks. So we get muscle memory. It's a good thing because of efficiency, but it can become a problem. What happens is that if we do something with inappropriate technique, inappropriate form, things of that nature, our body gets used to it. And then we don't realize that it actually can be harmful for our body just because we're so used to doing it that way. Again, bear with me on this, but it's a fun activity that I like to get people doing. Just slide back from your desk or wherever you're at and just cross your arms for me. So just bring your arms across in front of you and hang out like that for a second. And then as soon as you're in that position, what I want you to do is actually recross your arms, but go the opposite direction. So crossing opposite arm over the other way, if that makes sense. And for a lot of people, I know it's tough because I can't see facial reactions, anything like that, but for a lot of people, it almost feel awkward to bring your arms into, the opposite position crossed. Another really easy one is bringing hands together in front of you and clasping, and then trying to actually alternate which finger is on top. You almost can get to a point where you feel like you have someone else's hands attached to your body, right? There's a lot of examples of this kind of throughout life. Next time you go to put on shoes or pull on a pair of pants, stop yourself and try to go the opposite leg first. And a lot of times you'll realize that it really throws you off. So we just create these patterns, these muscle patterns and muscle memory. And again, if we start doing things in an inappropriate way, such as, maybe just lifting something off the ground or the floor, if we start doing that inappropriately from an early age or early work experience, then our body will get used to doing it that way. And even though we may be inflicting harm, inflicting pain on ourselves, it just feels like the right way to do it because we've created that pattern. So sometimes we have to actually work out of some of these muscle memory patterns. So one goal of the class is just going to be to think about, is there certain tasks that I'm having discomfort with, or certain things that I'm doing that I'm having issues with? And is there another way to do it that may be a little better for me and a little better on my body? This is just a Department of Labor statistics that I like to show at my presentations, just to get people thinking a little bit. And this was a couple of years ago, but it's still pretty relevant. They haven't released any updated information on it yet. They usually do these studies a couple of years apart. But basically what this is showing is it's showing injury risks across, just in general labor. And it's showing that 20% of the injury risks that we see are from the job tasks alone, right? So the fact that, you got to go out and plant crops, you got to go out and, deal with the cows, whatever it may be, 20% of that risk is going to be there. But the remaining 80% is actually risk created from worker habit or how we're completing those job tasks. And I never show this as a way to like place blame upon the people who are getting injured, because our company is actually all about the opposite of that. We kind of stand up for the workers. But I just show it to say that, there's a possibility that 80% of the risks that we're kind of taking in doing our job tasks on a daily basis could be minimized or maybe even eliminated just by simply changing our work habits. When we're looking at actual risk factors for musculoskeletal disorders or the cumulative trauma disorders, one of the biggest one is poor work posture or awkward posture. I mean, we'll talk about specific scenarios. We'll kind of work through the body, spine, shoulders, wrist as we go through and look at specifics on risk factors. But that's a really big one. Repetition is going to be the other one that's pretty big, right? And this one, unfortunately, there's not a lot that we can do with it. There's some engineering things sometimes that can come into play. But again, sometimes the repetition just has to happen. Inadequate rest to work ratio is another really big one that a lot of times I know in the agricultural field can be a tough one to manage, right? But basically, it's just the idea that when you're resting, sleeping in particular, is really when your body and your muscle and everything's going to start to recoup. So what happens is when we start to, just overwork ourselves and not allow enough time for that rest to occur, we can get into trouble and we can increase risk factor for injury pretty significantly. I'm by no means a sleep doctor by any means, but they say 6 to 8 hours for sleeping is really where you should try to shoot for as a goal. The closer you can get to that, the better, just because that's really going to be what allows you to get that adequate rest in and kind of recover from a lot of the work that you're doing. Direct trauma and contact stress. These are generally things that just happen, by accident, right? Slips, trips, falls, hard to avoid, but we can be conscious of them as much as we can. There are a couple examples of contact stress that we can usually eliminate just by being mindful, and we'll talk about that again a little bit later into the presentation. High force, lifting, pushing, pulling, grip, right? As force goes up, unfortunately, so does risk of injury, just because, again, it's more strain, it's more wear and tear on our bodies. And then vibration is another big one that, especially in the ag fields, whether it's machinery, right, or whether it's equipment that you're running, vibration can be something that adds in risk factor as well. Has a lot to do just with the fact that, your nerves are kind of getting filled with that vibration. So you're not sensing as much pain, discomfort, overuse, and that can create risk. Again, as we look through this list in front of us here, if you're seeing some of these that you're a little worried about because you're undergoing them, and you're kind of putting your body at risk with them throughout the day, just realize that generally it's going to be multiple of these risk factors combined to really produce an injury. So a goal would be to just get as little of this list involved as possible throughout your daily tasks. What we do at IHMS and here in Vermont really is, we work with ergonomics, and there's a lot of different definitions out there. What are ergonomics? And you might read, if you do 10 different searches, you might get 10 different definitions. To make it really simple, it's really just the study of work with the goal of fitting the job to the worker. I feel like what happens in many situations is that we end up molding ourselves in order to get the job done, whether that means working overtime, more hours, whether that means physically, putting ourselves in awkward postures. So what we like to do is try to step back and think about actually creating a work environment so that it's better for the worker and it takes strain and stress off of them. We like to go through what we call the 5 E's of injury elimination. And again, these are kind of what we're working on today. And right after these slides, we're going to get right into the meat of things. So but engineering and ergonomics is the first thing. Sometimes this is really easy. More times than not, this becomes more of a heavy expense and a little bit of a bigger process. But, as time goes on, as technology gets better, there's certainly a lot more of this that's becoming accessible for agricultural workers, in many different fields. One of maybe the most basic examples is, some of that may be crop gathering, right? Whatever it may be, apple picking is the example we have right here. There's a lot of different extendable tools, sticks that you can use in order to, give yourself a better lever arm, or, just help your body be in a little bit better posture so that you're not creating an unnecessary risk factor. On the grander spectrum of that, one of the easy examples that I can think of that you may work with, anyone that's around, any kind of hay work, those hay ladders that they make, the belts that kind of can move the hay bales up into higher lofts. That's a really good example of engineering, so that, a person isn't actually lifting physically and lugging and carrying hay all the way up 2 flights anymore. We now have the accessibility to use a little bit of that engineering to decrease risks. Education is basically just what you guys are doing today. So you've already started off on the right foot just by, attending this class, and hopefully we're going to give you plenty of good things to think about and apply moving forward. But it's really just the ability to understand and identify risk factors throughout your day. And if you have the ability to do that, then you'll start to have the ability to actually address them and make change. So that's kind of your exposure reduction, applying your ergonomics, applying your education to your actual everyday tasks in order to help decrease risk and start decreasing strain on the body. Exercising and stretching is another really big one. And this might be, one of the biggest ones as far as day in and day out, decreasing risk factors. Again, it just goes with the concept that every day you're going to be having risk factors and you're going to be having strain. So you got to make sure you're taking time with stretches, with exercising, to kind of get your body in shape and keep it in shape for the job tasks that you're doing. And then the last thing is just enforcement. And again, this comes from each other. If you're someone that works alone agriculturally, it's tough because you are your own enforcement. But certainly if you're working with a group and you've got coworkers, it can be a good idea if you see someone doing something, a lift, for example, and we're going to go through lifting form in just a second, but doing a lift that looks, real unhealthy. Sometimes it's helpful just to let them know in a nice way. There may be a better way that we can do that so that you're not going to get hurt, especially for new employees. If you're someone that's a little more senior and you've kind of learned the more efficient ways, it can be really helpful to let new employees and people that are just new to the field in on some of those tips. So kind of the way the rest of this will be set up is that we're going to work through a little bit of anatomy. So I'm going to show you a couple different of the body parts, muscles, tendons, bones. And the goal of this is just going to be to help you guys understand, what that anatomy looks like. And by doing that, it makes a lot more sense why we see injuries occur. So like I said, we'll kind of work through the body differently. We'll start with the spine and we'll go through kind of some of the common injuries that we would expect in the agricultural field. And we'll address those and talk about some other risks and how to work those out. So starting off, we're going to start at the spine. I know personally, I have, I guess 3 or 4 different dairy farms within my family or my wife's family. And back pain is probably one of the biggest complaints that I hear from, a farmer or someone in that agricultural field. So the spine is something that's good to think about from, early on, keeping it safe, so that we can try to minimize, long-term the injuries and the wear and tear that we see throughout the spine. So looking at the anatomy itself, and I won't get too far into this just because I don't want to bore everyone and put them to sleep on this noontime presentation. But like I said, it's good to just understand a basic concept. We have 3 curves in that spine if you look at. So when you start at the top, you have the cervical, right? And then you have your thoracic, and then you have your lumbar. Those are kind of the 3 major curves. The spine is actually supposed to maintain those curves, throughout the tasks that we do. The reason being is that's actually an injury prevention mechanism. So tell people, you almost think of that as like a shock absorber. So that spine is going to be the strongest when it has those 3 curves and when it has an ability to kind of take some of that shock and impact. Whereas when you get your spine either really curved, into one big curve, which we'll talk about in a second, or if you get your spine very straight, what you see a lot of impact going straight up through the entire spine as opposed to being dissipated out. So 3 curves you want to maintain, important to realize that. The biggest risk factor that we generally will see is what we call a large C curve. And I'm going to try to show you guys, I know it's a little tough here with the camera, but basically what that looks like, and it's with lifting a lot of times, it's when people end up kind of in this big posture like this, legs straight, right, not bending at the knees, doing a lot of their lifting through their back. It will place them in that large C curve. That becomes a big issue with the spine for a couple different reasons. The first being it puts a lot of pressure on our discs. So again, if you look kind of in between each one of these vertebrae here, what you'll see is that there's a little disc in between each one. There's a lot of fancy terminology when it comes to discs and herniations. I like to tell people what you really got in there is a jelly donut, right? So if you went down to your Dunkin' Donuts or your Starbucks or, you know, wherever you may be, whatever big donut shop you got a jelly donut and you stuck it in between your vertebrae. On a very small term, that's kind of what we're working with. So what happens is that when we're lean forward and we're kind of in that big curve for a long time, our vertebrae come together in the front, so they close that space. And when you have a disc in there, imagine again, if we go back to our jelly donut, what would happen if you squeezed on one side of a jelly donut long enough, hard enough over time, right? That jelly's only got one where to go, and it's kind of out the opposite side. And that's basically a disc herniation, which is a really common injury that we see in the agricultural field and just in the manual labor field. So again, thinking about spine position, thinking about setting yourself up so that you're in good posture with lifts, carrying, right, all these tasks is a good way to help decrease strain and injury. The other big thing that you want to think about is the muscles of the spine. So a big misconception about spinal muscles is that people think that they're real heavy, strong muscles that are made for lifting. The muscles that are in your spine are really there just to stabilize and kind of protect that spine and keep it in the correct posture. So more so than power muscles, they're postural muscles. And their job is to maintain those three curves. And I'm going to show you a picture here in the next slide. If you look all the way in the center of this picture, what you'll notice is that some of these spine muscles are really small. And just to give you a little bit better of a reference, muscles that run up either side of the spine are really about the width of your pinky. So they're not super dense, not super large muscles. So when you start taking a muscle that's this big and you start bending forward and lifting with inappropriate postures, right? Doing kind of one of these lifts, what you end up doing is you end up really overusing that muscle and you know, requiring it to do a lot more than what it's set up and what it's anatomically able to tolerate. So we see strains, pulls, tears. So, you know, not only is there disc issue risks, but there's also a lot of muscular risks within that spine. So your spinal risk factors are going to be improper bending, which is probably the biggest one, and specifically with lifting. But, you know, this could be, again, with picking, if you're doing any kind of, you know, crop retrieval stuff. This could be if you're more like in a dairy setup, it could be more milking. You know, there's a whole lot of different positions and tasks that may require you to do that improper bend. Or on the other end of that, if you're running machinery, right, operating machinery, you're sitting in a chair, again, that forward slouch is going to be what puts you at risk for strains, for herniation, as well as tears and issues within the back. So how should we be lifting? If there's one thing that you take away from this entire presentation today, proper lifting form may be one of the most important. So try to kind of cue in on this, and this can be really, really helpful. So proper lifting form, what we're really looking for here is we're looking for you to maintain that three curves within the spine. The way that you do that is something that we call shut the door. And this is a little bit of a goofy concept, but you basically want to push your hips back and you want to get your weight so that it's on your heels as opposed to on your toes. The reason why we use the reference shut the door is that movement that you make with your hips in order to kind of set yourself up into that lift position is, imagine you get home from the grocery store, you got 2 bags of grocery in each hand and your car door's open. It's that exact movement where you're just pushing the hips back to shut the door, right? So it's a goofy one, but that's the exact posture that you want to be in order to set up a good lift, is hips back. From there, you want to keep weight through your heels, and then you want to bend at your knees. A common mistake that we see people make with lifting form is they think the only thing they need to do is bend the legs. But if you don't push those hips back first, then what you end up doing is you end up bending with your knees going much further forward than your toes. And that loads up your knee joint, and that can give you knee issues in the future as well. I always tell people, anyone that's a baseball fan will know that catchers really don't have a very long career. And the reason being is they're kind of in that forward slouch posture where their knees are much more forward than their toes. And they maintain that position, and it just wears out your knees really fast. So hips back, right? Then you're going to bend at the legs. And then once you get that weight or whatever you're picking up, lifting, you want to make sure that you keep that nice and close to your body, right? The further away you get from your body, the more you're going to load up your back. And there's pretty cool stat. Just going arm's length, they've done some research, and simply, if you got a 10-pound weight, just going arm's length, it increases the pressure on your back by 10 times. So, now you've got something that's really light and easy, just 10 pounds shouldn't be a problem. You kind of do an inappropriate lift or you reach with that weight, and now you've put 100 pounds worth of force throughout the spine, which is pretty significant. So just keep that in mind as much as you can. Any kind of lift, whether it's a pen off the floor, whether it's a small vegetable right from the ground, or whether it's a really heavy piece of machinery or weight, you want to make sure you're trying to lift with the same exact form and get yourself into that habit. Again, going back to muscle memory, if you're someone that's lifted with poor form for most of your life, it's going to feel awkward and it's going to feel more hard or more challenging in order to do a correct lift. But if you can train yourself to get into this habit, you'll decrease your risk factors of injury in the long run pretty significantly. Now, at the very bottom here, we have, what if bending is required? Because one thing that happens that's really easy for, someone that's in my position that just is educating people on lifting, on carrying. It's easy for me to tell you what you should and shouldn't do. But the fact of the matter is sometimes you will have to more than likely put yourself in, an improper bending scenario, whether it's you're reaching around something, whether it's, just the setup of your task, you will probably have to end up in these positions sometimes. So the best thing that you can do, realize one, that it's a risky posture and that you'd be increasing your risk factor. And then two, do a little maintenance to offset that risk that that you've had to undergo. So stretching to equalize disc pressure and to prevent deformity in the back is a really big one. So for this one, what I'll have you guys do, if you have space and if you're in a place where this is okay for you to do and you're willing to, I just want everyone to stand up, find a little space. And then all you're going to do here is just a back bend stretch. So you're just bringing hands to the low back, and then nice and slow, you're just going to extend backwards. Just hold for about 5 to 10 seconds, and then you can come a little bit higher up the spine here, link in, and same exact technique, just nice and easy, shouldn't be painful. Now, if you do that stretch, that back bend, and that feels very alleviating and good to you, then there's a good sign that you probably have some forward pressure on those discs, because what you're doing there is you're doing in the opposite position in order to neutralize and help some of that pressure come back forward. So again, that's a really good skill to use if you know that you're going to be doing prolonged forward bending, or again, if you have to do improper lifting, this is a really good option to kind of offset that risk factor. The neck and the arm is another really big thing that we like to think about. And again, this kind of goes hand in hand with the forward bend and the slouch. But it's important to realize that, good posture and neutral positioning is important to allow for that blood flow to come through the neck and the arm, as well as nerves. A lot of people don't realize the anatomy of the hands and the arms, but your nerves start from your neck, come all the way down through the front of the shoulder, and then they go down and innervate hands, fingers, as well as, your arteries and some of that blood flow. So what happens is that, again, when we get slouched and forward bent, head comes forward, shoulders roll forward, which I would imagine even some people probably watching this presentation might be starting to get into that posture. What you want to do is try to combat that and really open things up. So, tingling in the hands, fingers. We've had people before come into, physical therapy with a diagnosis of, carpal tunnel syndrome, which we'll talk about here, but basically, an issue down in the wrist. Even with the intent that if physical therapy doesn't work, they're going to go in and get surgery on that carpal tunnel. And we end up just working on the chest and the front of the shoulder and the neck and loosening things up. And within 2 or 3 weeks, all their symptoms have cleared out. So sometimes issues can come from up here and people don't realize. One thing that we like to say around our office and kind of push out at a lot of our companies is that life draws you forward. So, imagine some of your tasks. Like I said, for an example, just watching this presentation, you're probably looking at a computer screen, right? A monitor that's in front of you. If you're eating, if you're driving, right? Everything that we do is kind of out in front of us. Phones are another really big one now, texting, right? Most job tasks, very few job tasks that don't require a fair amount of forward reach or forward bend. So what happens, again, everything's pulling you forward. You combine that with a downward gravity pull, and it just makes sense that we end up in these slouch forward positions. And especially as we get old, you'll see if you walk around, the rest of this week and look at people in their older age, a lot of people are actually kind of working forward and stuck into that forward slouch position, just because more than likely they've worked hard their whole life, and that's just kind of been a downward spiral that's pulled them in that direction. So again, working out of this is very important, something to think about when you're thinking about positioning yourself and your work. So a couple good examples here. Like I said, driving's a really big one. So tractor, car, whatever it may be, you can see how that's going to pull your shoulders forward, and generally your head's going to follow your shoulders, especially the longer that you do that task. And then I had to put this in here just because, again, I'm used to dairy farming. So, a milking machine's a really big one. But again, if you're reaching underneath a cow prolonged time, depending on how many head of cow you have in your barn, right, or your farm, that could be a long time that you're stuck in that position. Or on the other term, if you're doing more, crop work, planting, right, picking, all that stuff, a lot of it's going to be out in front of you. Some of it might be at a higher level, but it's still going to be forward and out in front. So again, you want to try to stretch to offset these risk factors as much as possible. So I'll ask you guys, if you don't mind, again, just to find a little space, and I'm going to give you 2 or 3 stretches on this one. So the first one looks somewhat similar to the last stretch that we did. You're just bringing hands kind of back onto the low back. But then for this one, you're just extending your neck and your head up towards the ceiling. And you're going to get 2 benefits from this. The first one being that you're going to actually stretch out some of these anterior neck muscles themselves. But the other thing to realize is that just like in your low back and all the way through your spine, you have your vertebrae and you have your disc in that upper neck and cervical spine. So same thing, you're going to offset that pressure. The next one that you're going to do, and this one you may be able to get away with in your chair, depending on what you have, but if not, you can stand right up. You're just going to open hands up and you're going to pull them back until you get a stretch through front of the chest, kind of the pec. You may get it in the forearms a little bit. So again, this is a really simple stretch, but it's really efficient for opening up and loosening some of those muscles that are tight all day long. And then to take that one a step further, all you would do is bring hands behind the back. First movement's going to be away from the body, and then the second movement is going to be straight down towards the floor. And same thing, you can imagine what that's going to do is that's going to pull shoulders back into the opposite direction that they want to go to all day long. So both those 2 examples above, and like I said, the ones that we talked about, everything's just going to pull you in the opposite way. It's going to pull you forward. So as much as you can, you want to try to work out of that. As a general rule of thumb with these recovery stretches, 15 to 30 seconds is a good time frame. And I usually tell people 1.5 hours to 2 hours is kind of your goal. If you can work them in every 1.5 hours to 2 hours, you'll find pretty significant benefit. Shoulders, the next joint that we're going to talk about here, because this is another big one, probably behind back. This might be the second most common thing that we see. Rotator cuff injuries are really common amongst agricultural workers. 2 ways that we see these injuries happen. One is just the traumatic. So again, you slip and fall, right? Or, you get caught up in something, whatever it may be, you get that quick traumatic impact that can certainly cause injuries. More commonly, what we see is overuse injuries. This shoulder and the joint and the muscles just kind of getting worn down over prolonged work. So again, starting with a little bit of anatomy here, we're going to think about what type of joint the shoulder is. So if you look in the picture that's on the slide here, it's a ball and socket joint, right? So you got the top of that arm bone, which kind of creates the ball, and then you got the shoulder girdle, which creates that socket. There's another ball and socket joint within the body. I usually quiz people on this, but seeing as we're kind of set up virtual, I'll just go through it. The other one is your hip, right? So your hip is your other ball and socket joint, big one that we have in the body. Big difference between the hip and the shoulder. And that's kind of the next point that's on the slide here. It's the stability versus mobility, right? So the hip joint is very, very stable, right? It's a deeper joint. So what that means is that that socket goes a lot further around the ball, whereas the shoulder joint, not so much. The socket's still going around the ball, but it's certainly not as deep and it's not as secure as the hip joint. The reason being is that we get mobility for the shoulder. So again, most people are going to have a lot more mobility in their shoulders than they are their hips, right? It's not very often that you see someone take their leg and swing it around right up towards their head. Usually that means injury, right? Or a lot of laxity in the joint itself. So more times than not, you're going to have a lot less mobility in the hip and a lot more mobility in that shoulder. So it's good, it's functional because we do a lot with our hands, we do a lot with our arms, we have to reach in a lot of different directions, but it does increase risk for injury just because what happens is that the muscles are going to have to work a lot harder to keep that ball and socket in the shoulder in place, especially when we're doing forceful tasks. Combined with that fact, you know, our rotator cuff, which are just 4 muscles that make up that cuff, kind of go around that ball and hold it into the socket. They're not super large muscles, right? So unfortunately, we just weren't built with super meaty rotator cuff muscles. They initiate every single motion from the shoulder. So it doesn't matter, you know, what degree or what way you're moving your arm. If you move your arm and your hand in any direction, that means your rotator cuff's involved. And what that means is that when we have injuries with the rotator cuff, it becomes pretty debilitating. You know, a lot of times when you see someone with a real significant rotator cuff injury, they end up with just their arm against their body in a sling until they end up getting some medical attention done because, like I said, it's always turned on whenever we're doing anything. So weak muscles are a real big problem just because, again, like we talked about with the spinal muscles and some of the smaller muscles, they're not strong, they're going to get overworked and they're going to fatigue fast and they're going to get strains and tears. And tight muscles are an issue as well, just because what happens with tight muscles, you can imagine the ball and socket joint, you know, we get imbalances and we get inappropriate pressure put on different areas because of muscles being tight. From a risk factor standpoint, first thing that you want to think about with keeping the shoulder safe is same thing for the back. So you can see how this becomes kind of efficient if you're focusing on, you know, work safety. So a lot of these things work hand in hand. Keeping that weight close. So again, this is just an easy example with hay bale work, but you know, the further away you reach with a bale or with any kind of weight, or even, you know, typing, any of that stuff, the further away your hands get, the more you're going to load up the shoulder joint and the rotator cuff muscles. So we talked about the increase in force on the back, same exact thing. They've done studies and statistics with the shoulders, 7 times the force on the rotator cuff just with reaching arms out straight. So same example, right? If you got a 10-pound item and rather than bringing it with your body and keeping it close when you go to set it on something or hand it off, now what you've done is you've made that item about 70 pounds worth of force on the rotator cuff muscles in the shoulders. So really important that you want to keep that weight close. You want to keep it in tight as much as possible. If you are stacking or placing things, which I know sometimes that's a common occurrence in ag work, take the time to walk around if you can. So this top right picture shows, you know, someone that's obviously organizing some bales together, but, you know, take the time to actually move where you're going as opposed to reaching across a stack of something or reaching across, you know, a whole set of bales. I know that this seems cumbersome and it seems like, you know, in a job where efficiency really is kind of the main goal. It seems like you're going to be wasting a lot of time, but what I like to get people thinking in the mindset of is, you know, 4 to 5 seconds each hay bale, you add that up, it's still going to be quite a bit less time than, you know, 3-6 months out with a rotator cuff injury, and especially if you need surgery. So, you know, you pick and choose your battles, but the more that you can set a little bit extra time to be safe, the better off, in my opinion, in the long run. And then the other thing to think about here for shoulders in particular is just that it's best to limit overhead lifting as much as possible. So again, if we go back just real quick to this anatomy, when you look at the top of the ball and socket joint, what you'll see is there's one rotator cuff muscle that runs right in between kind of the top of the shoulder, the ball, and then your acromion process, which you can see that on the picture there. So that supraspinatus tendon is what I'm talking about. What happens when we get into an overhead position is we're basically taking that ball, kind of jamming it up to the top of the socket, and then we're working, we're moving it, we're using things. So that acromion process on some people, which is this area here that you can see the arrows there, that sometimes is even hooked around on the edge of the shoulder. So you take that acromion process and you take that supraspinatus tendon. Once those hands go up, you're basically grinding that tendon into that acromion process. This is not a pleasant sight or thought, but you basically, you know, if you were to take a steak knife and just kind of slowly wear into a piece of steak, that's what you're doing to that tendon. So whenever possible, you want to try to avoid overhead stuff, overhead positioning. You do have to go overhead. One tip that I like to tell people is keep your elbows tucked. So most people have just the habit, as soon as hands come up, their elbows come up with it. We call it kind of chicken winging. But if you can get in the habit as your hands come up to keep your elbows tucked, that puts your shoulder in a much better position right here compared to this is a lot different. So the more you can keep those shoulders down and elbows tucked, the better off you'll be. Pushing versus pulling is another big thing that we like to cover off on just when we're talking about kind of shoulders in particular, but this is good to think about with the whole body itself. So generally I like to ask people, you know, what would you think is safer or more safe to do, a push versus a pull? I always tell people you got a 50-50 shot on this one, but a lot of times people will think that pulling is actually a safer option just because, you know, it feels sometimes a little more natural and feels like you can generate a little more force. But push is actually going to be a safer option whenever you get a chance. So whether that means you're swinging open a gate, whether that means you're pushing a wheelbarrow, right, whatever it may be, if you can get away with push is going to be much better for you. The only reason being, and it's a simple reason, but you're not physically strong enough to push yourself apart. You are physically strong enough to pull yourself apart. What I mean by that is if you grab onto something, there's more weight there than you think, or maybe there's something wedged under the wheel or whatever you're pulling on, and you go with your full force to start a pull, you are physically strong enough if that doesn't budge to pull apart, you know, your elbow, to pull apart your shoulder, pull apart your wrist, your back, whatever it may be. Whereas if you go to push something and it doesn't budge, more times than not, what you end up doing is maybe just getting a little bump on the face, right? You get a little ego check, but you walk away from it unharmed. So if possible, you want to think about pushing when you can. If you do have to pull, there's safe ways to do it. So using your legs, again, similar to doing lifts, if you can use your legs to generate force as opposed to your arms, your shoulders, and your back, you're going to be much better off. So what we coach people to do is use what we call a staggered stance. And you'll see kind of in the bottom left picture here on this presentation, that's a really like a golden picture of a staggered stance. So whether you're pushing or pulling, that's the posture you want to start in. Because the other thing to think about is that the most amount of force is generally going to be required when you initiate movement, right? So you got to break that initial friction. And then once you get something moving, more times than not always the case, but usually your force requirement is going to be a lot lower just because you've already broken that friction and you're using momentum. So especially when you start a push or a pull, staggered stance, elbows tucked close to your side, right? Again, same as lifting or reaching, elbows tucked close to your side. And then you want to generate that force with your legs as opposed to with your arms, your shoulders, or your back. So keep that in mind with push-pull stuff. And then this top picture on the right here where pulling is, one of the worst things that you can do when you're pulling something is this position here. We got both hands behind the back, holding on to that. I don't know how applicable this is to ag work. I know we see it a lot with like pallet jacks and dollies in some of the industrial companies that we go and work at, but I can imagine that it could become applicable in some places and some tasks with ag work. So again, if you ever see anyone pulling with both hands behind their back, make sure you stop them right away, because what you've done here is you've taken your rotator cuff, you've maxed it out so that it can't go any further. So again, if what you're pulling catches or stops quick, the only place you can go is hyperextension and injury. So if you do have to pull, you want to face that object, get that moving. And then the way that you would want to do it would actually be, you know, one hand, keep it close to your body so that you have a little reaction time, wiggle room, so that you're not going to go into overextension and injury. So big takeaways there. If you're able to push, that's going to be great. That's going to be better. And then if you do have to pull, or if you're pushing, just make sure that you're generating force with your legs and you're keeping things in close as much as possible. We're going to get into the wrist next. Carpal tunnel, this is another really common one. Again, we talked a little bit earlier about how sometimes that can be an issue up in the neck and the shoulder, but a lot of times it can also be a pure carpal tunnel issue. So a little bit of anatomy here on the carpal tunnel. What we're looking at here is basically just a cross-sectional cut on that wrist. You'll see that you have bone, and then you have really, really thick ligament and tendon kind of all the way around that wrist. So what it does create is an actual tunnel. And that's what we call a carpal tunnel. It's a little small area that all of your tendons for your fingers, right? So your finger flexor tendons, right? And as well as your nerves are going to have to all flow through there. What happens is it just takes one of those tendons to get irritated, a little inflammation in there. And since there's nowhere for that inflammation to go, because we're surrounded by solid structure, we see compression, right? So there's just no room. So everything starts compressing in on each other. And that's why we get a lot of tingling and numbness in the fingers and hands with carpal tunnel, is because that inflammation has actually started to compress the nerves and cut off the nerve flow. So that's just a little bit of anatomy with that carpal tunnel. As far as your risk factors go, one of the biggest carpal tunnel risk factors that we see much too often is using the hand as a hammer, right? Or using the palm of your hand in order to bump or nudge something. We see that a lot in all trades, you know, whether it's agricultural, whether it's industrial, whether it's just someone working around the house. It's a common occurrence. People just think that, you know, for some reason, this is a good idea. What you've done when we think about, you know, our traumatic area here, you take an area that's already prone to inflammation-based issues and trauma-based issues, and now you're creating that direct trauma right into that area. So again, it seems like a goofy one, but if you pay attention, you might find that you see a lot of people doing this. You want to stop that right away, just because that's going to really increase risk factors for issues. The next biggest thing is going to be working with hands in awkward postures, and specifically doing that with force. So again, when you're using hand tools, right, whatever it may be, the more you can keep your wrist neutral, right, not bend into flexion, not into extension, any of those things, you're going to be at a decreased risk for that carpal tunnel. So exercise, I like to show people with this. Just bring your hand nice and neutral like this out in front of you, and just make a good fist, right? Do that maybe 2 or 3 times, right? You feel pretty efficient. You feel pretty strong with that. Now, let your hand relax. Bring yourself into a flex position as much as possible. And I'm going to kind of over exaggerate this, and then go easy with this, but try to make the same fist. You can feel kind of the resistance. You can feel like the inefficiency there, right? So that's just the, you know, that's a grand example. I really exaggerated it, but you know, any degree of awkward posture is going to make your tendons and your muscles just be a lot less efficient. So it requires them to do a lot more in order to, you know, complete the same task. So as much as possible, neutral positioning is really what you want to focus on. Sleeping posture is another big one that we see issues. You know, not only can this be a risk factor, but this can also be kind of a warning sign and an identifier for carpal tunnel issues. If you're waking up a lot at night and you have wrists curled in, right, or curled underneath you and compressed, if your hands kind of want to go into this position once you fall asleep and you're relaxed, it's a good sign that you have too much tightness in your wrist flexors and that you're going to be at an increased risk for carpal tunnel. They do make night splints, they call them, which are basically just soft braces that are, you know, they got one firm structure in there, and it just holds you into a neutral position so that when you sleep, you don't find yourself bound up here. Especially if you're someone that does a lot of gripping tasks all day long, the last thing that you want to do is fall asleep for 8 hours and let your hands stay tight and in this position. So again, prevention factor or something that you can do to offset these risks is going to be stretching. So for a carpal tunnel stretch, all you're going to do, and you guys can do this here right at the computer if you'd like, palm up towards the ceiling, arm out straight, so elbow extended, and you're just going to pull hand back towards you, fingers back towards you, until you get a good stretch through your flexors, which will be just the top of that forearm. So again, 15 to 30 seconds, and then you can alternate and you can work the opposite side. So that stretch is really simple, really easy to do. You can do it anywhere, right? It doesn't take a lot of space. If you're working with people, or if you yourself are working with any kind of job task with a lot of grip, so whether you're, you know, shearing, crimping, you know, just picking up lifting, any of those things, you want to make sure you're working those flexor stretches to try to loosen that up, and that'll significantly decrease risk factors for carpal tunnel. Got just a couple more things. We're almost done here. We're getting towards the end. Epicondylitis is the other big one, and this is kind of the last one that we'll hit on. But this is, elbow issue. They call it tennis elbow or golfer's elbow. And basically, what happens, your tennis elbow is going to be on the outside of the elbow, so basically out here, and your golfer's elbow is going to be on the inside. And it just has to do with basically the movement. So tennis elbow is an extension or extensor-based issue. The idea that, like, when people were bringing through a tennis racket, right, hitting a backhand shot, they were turning on all the extensors in their forearm. Whereas golf, you're coming through this way in this motion, and you're getting more resistance on your flexors that attach on the inside of the elbow. Similar to carpal tunnel, the way that this injury works, it's an inflammation-based issue, right? It's a itis, we call it. So epicondylitis, which just means inflammation of. So the tendon in the forearm, right? Got a muscle belly that runs here, comes into a tendon, and that tendon connects right on either the outside or the inside of the elbow. And all that happens is that tendon gets overworked, it gets irritated, and it gives you pain right where it connects onto that bone. So again, different risk factors for this, but you're going to want to try to decrease that inflammation and then loosen your muscles so that you're not getting as much tension and strain. Risk factors for tennis elbow or golfer's elbow. But specifically for the tennis elbow, which is more common, we see that in the outside of the elbow. Palm down lifting is a really big one. So, hay bale twine's a big one. If people are grabbing onto that, they usually grab on with their hands like this, and then they do that over and over again. 5-gallon pails, buckets is another big one, especially if they have the handles still on them. You see a lot of people kind of reach down and grab them and carry them with their palms down. Basically, what that does is it just makes it so all that strain and stress is going through that wrist and forearm muscle, which is not quite as big, right? So we kind of see the trend here. Smaller muscles, more prone to overuse injuries. What you want to try to do, if possible, is get either palms up or get your thumbs up. Because what that's going to do is that's going to transfer your strain onto your bicep muscle, which is it's bigger, it's more durable. So as much as possible, palms up, thumbs up is what we want to do there. And again, just think about your wrist posture. So like we got an example here, someone that's just, clipping off some plant ends here, but you can see that they're kind of in that extended position. So as much as possible, you want to kind of bend your body down so you can be a little more neutral as opposed to working prolonged and extended position. And then this is going to combine that force as well, where you're doing, repetitive, forceful gripping for something like clipping. Seems like nothing to do it 1 or 2 times, but if you're doing that thousands of times or hundreds of times in a day, it's a good way to flare up the elbow. So stretching to offset this, similar setup as the last stretch, but what you're going to do is roll the hand over, and then you're going to come into stretch back like this, and that's going to hit more the top of the forearm and into that elbow. So again, 15-30 seconds is what you're looking for on this stretch. And then you flip-flop and you work the same way. So roll the forearm over and come into a stretch. Whether it's carpal tunnel or whether it's this epicondylitis, right? Tennis elbow, golfer's elbow. One thing that you can start doing immediately for kind of prevention, or if you start to feel this coming on, would be doing some ice at the end of each day. So again, knowing that it's an inflammation-based injury, in theory, ice, ibuprofen, Advil, right, whatever you want to use, if you can get that inflammation out of there, you should start to feel quite a bit better. And then you just want to focus on avoiding some of these risk factors and adding in your stretches more frequently. So neutral positioning, why is it important? Again, it's just kind of going to help our function, right? So it's going to make us more efficient. And this is just a really simple example, but basically what I'm going to have everyone do here, just so they can kind of feel the difference between bad posture and function versus good posture and function, is I'm going to have you just sit with your worst posture. What I mean by that is round your shoulders forward, kind of bring your head down, nice good slouch here. And I want you to try to lift your arms overhead as you do that. So that probably doesn't feel super easy. It shouldn't feel very easy. It should feel kind of tough and it feel like you have resistance. And then from there, what you want to do is the opposite. So bring shoulders down and back, Get your head back over your shoulders, and then try to lift your arms up overhead. And you should notice a pretty significant difference in that, you're just more efficient. You have a much easier range of motion if you're in that good posture. And again, it just has to do with balance of joints. So this can be applied to a lot of different body parts, but the idea is that you just want to focus on neutral positioning and neutral posture as much as possible. And that's going to create, increased function. It's going to create overall improvement of movement. So that can be really helpful to think about. So kind of getting into just a little bit of review here. You guys have made it through the bulk of everything. So just kind of bringing everything back together at the end. Just know damage and repair is going to be a cycle that, you really can't affect, especially the damage end of it. What you can affect is the repair and how much repair you're doing on your body. So, remember we started at the beginning with some of that muscle memory stuff, thinking about how you're doing your tasks, especially if you're having aches and pains. If there's one job that, whether it's happening on a daily basis, whether it's happening on a weekly or whether it's a yearly, if you dread that job and you say, man, I'm so sore every time I complete that for days, kind of look at that job itself and see, is there any way that you can do it differently that may benefit you, more and decrease your stress and have less issue long-term. The other thing that's important to realize, and it's unfortunate, sometimes I get in trouble talking about this, but, as we age, we just become a little more prone to injury, right? So the older you get, the more rest you need to recover, right? Your muscles, your ligaments, they come they're a little less flexibility, right? A little less water retention. We generally lose strength just as we age. So just know as you age, you might have to do a little more work. Same thing, if you think back to something like a vehicle or a truck, as they get older and older, right? You may need to put a little more effort into keeping them going. Our bodies are the same way, unfortunately. So stretching and exercising, one of the biggest and best things you can do to offset that daily wear and tear. That's one thing that you have full control over. And it can actually, just help you in the long run, not only while you're working functionally, but, even when you get done after work, if you ever have, retirement in your future, you want a body left to enjoy things with. So try to add that in as much as possible. And then, deep regular sleep, that's when the body's going to repair itself. So just keep that in mind. You got to try to get that sleep in whenever you can. The last slide that I like to just end off on is just kind of a first aid slide. And it's really just to get the mentality of, caring for your body. And, growing up, I had a father who was a lineman for the power company. And I find a little bit of crossover in some agricultural workers and some of my family members that are farmers as well. And that they kind of have this mindset, if it still hurts next year, I'll go and get it checked out. Unfortunately, more times than not, with that kind of mindset, things, they get worse and worse and they progressively turn into a bigger issue. So just think about if you do start to have aches, you do start to have discomforts and pains, you want to try to address them as early as possible and make sure that you're taking care of your body. And unfortunately, that does mean annual physicals and getting checkups, because aside from just muscles and ligaments, you also have your heart, you have a lot of things. So just a general thought to consider, put your body first and pay attention to it. It's pretty good at letting us know when there's an issue developing. And more times than not, if we address those early, we have a lot better outcome in the end. So that's kind of my last bit. Does anyone have any questions? I'm happy to stay on for a little while and answer any questions. I do see something going on in the chat here, which I apologize if I missed that. Let's see. Yep, so we got some comments on kind of bending with harvest and transplanting. So one other thing that I would say with, specifically transplant harvest stuff, and depending on what you're doing for work, depending on what your setup is, think about if there is different ways, raised beds or extendable, sticks, things like that. Is there anything out there that can help you, kind of that engineering? And then if not, just make sure you're really focusing on bending with legs, as well as focusing on offsetting. So, stretching, back bend stretches, stretching out the legs, stretching out the hips. That's going to be your best bet. Let's see what else we got here. Kinesio tape. Yeah, this is a good question, and there's a lot of different research out there on there. So it's funny, I see that they ask, is that a placebo or for real? So the research isn't 100% on it. You can again find different research studies that kind of claim different things. What there is some evidence to show is that one, it does help with a little bit of support. So, the idea with that kinesio tape, and anyone that doesn't know what that is it's basically just a stretched graded tape that you put a little bit of a stretch on and you apply it along a muscle. It is supposed to actually help with that muscle, with support wise, as well as postural cueing. So, a lot of times we'll use kinesio tape. We'll put it on someone's shoulders to kind of keep them upright. And what happens is as they come forward, they'll feel the tension on that tape and it'll kind of cue them and get them to think about, all right, I need to be back here. The other thing that there is some good research on is inflammation. So as far as bruising, swelling, kinesio tape is supposed to be good for decreasing some of that. And since it's a graded tape, it's good for pulling things out and kind of getting some of that return with inflammation. So there is some research out there. It's not super strong research. But the other thing that I always tell people with kinesio tape is that even if some of it may be placebo, it's not going to hurt anything, right? So aside from being a little expensive, I personally think that people do get some benefit from it. So I hope that answers that question a little bit. Let's see, we got some people practicing along. Awesome. Yeah, that's always good to know. I know it's tough with no cameras going, but I appreciate that. Trigger finger, really good question. Yeah, so this kind of goes hand in hand with the carpal tunnel. So again, just because your flexors run through here, and then your finger flexors pick up and run through the hand and finger. So as far as trigger fingers go, you still want to work this stretch here where you're pulling fingers back towards you and you're getting kind of the whole wrist and the forearm and the hands. But the other thing that you can add is you could actually start to stretch each finger itself. So, true trigger finger being kind of that pointer finger here. You'd want to actually start working that finger down into a stretch like this. And then the other thing that you always want to start working on is usually if people get bound up kind of down at the base of that tendon, is a little bit of self massage. So you can put some lotion on there. You can do a little bit of massage. I oftentimes like to recommend people will get a ball, whether it's a lacrosse ball, something like that, put it on a tabletop and roll out, just because sometimes what happens is that you end up working your other hand so much that you get your thumb irritated. So keep that in mind. But yeah, those are great stretches. Anything that's going to go the opposite way of that squeeze position, extension is going to be a good stretch. Let's see. Sometimes it's hard to work out during farm season. Yeah, so I mean, that's a really big one. If you can get into some form of exercise or some form of strength training, certainly you'll see benefits. And again, we like to kind of tell people that what they are is industrial athletes. So just like someone in the NBA that play basketball consistently, right? They're going to work out. They're going to be in the gym. Same thing. If you're someone that's doing, physical labor and especially agricultural farming stuff, I'd make the argument that you might be putting more demand on yourself than even some of those professional athletes just with tasks you're doing. So if you can find the energy, even just, a little bit, a couple times a week, you can certainly see a lot of benefits. And the other thing that I usually recommend is find something that's, functional training. I like to tell it. So especially if you're thinking about, weight training or anything like that. If you're someone that's bent over all day long and you're doing lifting all day long or planting all day long, think about doing things like squats or things that are going to strengthen your leg muscles so that when you actually go to perform your work tasks, you're getting direct benefit from some of those exercises and you're putting them to work. So keep that in mind. Again, you just want to be careful with overuse. So if you are someone that's working hard all day long, sometimes you got to pick and choose which days where they're working a little less intense are those going to be the days that, especially when you get the heavy weights, that I'm going to do, just because you don't want to overuse your tendons or your muscles. But certainly I recommend functional training and trying to get consistent exercise in. So that's a good point. Any other questions, or does that pretty much do it?
Looks good on my end. Mike, appreciate the presentation. It was definitely informative for me. We did record this and it will be posted onto the Cornell Cooperative Extension Ulster County's YouTube page. Thank you everyone for attending. Glad everyone who was here could make it. And Mike, thanks again. We appreciate the presentation.
Absolutely. I appreciate everyone tuning in and taking some time. Hopefully you found some things you can kind of apply going forward. So if you guys do have any questions or anything else like that, you can always reach out to me as well. Mike at IHMSpt.com. And I check that fairly consistently. So I'm always happy to answer questions.